Was your reading the second time different from the first time or not?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Easier.
Did you want to say something?
Yeah, it looks to me like just dishwashing after it's all dried up. You just put things in the cabinet.
So it still feels like dishwashing to you,
Yeah.
rather than laundry. Okay. Okay. That's good to know. So let's talk just for a moment about what happened when I was able. What I really did was I just simply activated your schema. That's all I did. I didn't give you new schema because you all had knowledge structures already. But I gave you something that helped you actually read differently. So what was the difference in this second reading from the first reading? And yes?
I thought it was really interesting with each sentence I held it up to the schema laundry. And I still had to translate sometimes, you know, like, it's better to do too few things at once than too many. So then I'm like, what does that mean in terms of laundry?
Right.
You know, does it mean sorting it into too many piles? Does it mean putting too many things in the machine? But it's like I still had to translate, but each sentence I'm holding up to the laundry idea.
Right, right. But once you did, it made sense?
I think it's better to do too few things at once than too many. You don't want to stuff the machine. But, you know, so I came up with a meaning. I don't know if that's the intended meaning.
Mm-hmm.
But
You came up with what?
a meaning.
meaning.
Don't put too many things in the machine. Do too few things at once rather than too many. I don't know if that's the intended meaning, but I was able to come up with a meaning that satisfied me and then move on to the
Well,
next.
it looks like what you came up with was maybe a main point for the piece, but the actual meaning is just really doing laundry. I mean, that's what, when you're reading it. And don't forget, this was a contrived, two psychologists sat down and made this up for this very purpose of trying to have you experience what the lack of schema does. Because I really want to impress upon you three things. One is that schema is totally necessary for comprehension. So if your students are reading something that they do not have schema for, which frequently we do in high schools, right? Oh yeah, read Of Mice and Men. You know, well many of our students don't really have any understanding of many parts of, you know, the Depression or what migrant workers' lives were like or anything else. So frequently they don't really have the schema to really understand what they're reading. And frequently students actually do have schema, just like you did, but the schema wasn't activated. So if it's not activated, they could experience reading something similar to your first reading the first time. So, you know, sometimes when I have time, I get into like, you know, were there any words you didn't understand? You know, no. Did anybody have trouble with the vocabulary? No. Then why didn't you understand it? And the answer is schema. Schema really helps people to reach that level of comprehension. Now, what happens when people don't have schema? What happened here? When they didn't have schema, what did people start doing? What did you guys start doing? Say that again?
Guessing.
Yeah, I mean, you're
find their
basically,
own schema.
yes, you are imposing your
your
own schema onto a text. And if you look at some of this, you know, some of the things that have to do with sorting or housework, like cooking or washing dishes, you can understand where that came from. It was sort of a little bit in those paragraphs. But look at how many different interpretations we can get from reading the same piece. And think about then, you know, your students who are not really, you know, they're just teenagers. They haven't had a lifetime of experience reading. And I just want to say that we develop schema about reading by reading. Right? So the more you read, the more your brain understands the phonological system, the syntactical system. It can pick up sight vocabulary more quickly. So you develop schema for all those levels that make you more efficient readers. 14-year-olds and 15-year-olds haven't really developed that ability yet. So again, just because something is right in front of them and seems obvious to you, they may not really interact with the text on a deep enough level where they're really at that level of total comprehension. And a lot of it is schema. And hang on just for one last second, because I want to say one more thing, and that is that we also develop schema for writing, right? And so these students, you know, even though the teacher has taught them whatever they've taught them about thesis statement and paragraph development, if they don't really have the schema for it, they will have trouble even understanding what those things are. So yes, I'm sorry.
I remember in English in high school, reading the words, it was the best of times, it was the worst of times. I had no idea what it was.
And what happened?
We learned about Charles Dickens and Tale of Two Cities.
Mm-hmm. So,
well, what happened is that I just didn't have the idea, and I couldn't even imagine what they were going to talk about.
and of course, those are beautiful sentences to start a big fat novel with, but notice that they also act as a frame for the entire book.
Remembered it 50 years later.
Right?
I think it also results in lack of attention for the student.
Say it again?
It's lack of attention for the student because he doesn't know what it is about, and so he doesn't pay attention.
Well, you bring me to my third point. Thank you very much. I appreciate that. Which is, how did you guys feel when you were reading it the first time? Did anybody feel? Yeah.
It was frustrating. It was so unclear.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Exactly. And
Like, I'm doing my part trying to understand, and the writer is not doing his or her part.
Yeah.
and I just want to say that in this particular case, the writers did that on purpose.
Right.
But I really need to tell you how much bad writing is out there.
Right.
The literature that they teach in high school is pretty good, actually. But you know, once they get to college or community college or college, they're forced to read these textbooks, and maybe in other classes here too, you know, science or history or whatever, that may not be very well written, because all you need to do to get a book published is tell the publisher, oh, I've got 40 students every semester in my one class, so I teach 3 of those classes, plus I do it in the spring. I guarantee you that they're going to buy a certain number of books, and they're like, published. But that doesn't mean that a published book is actually well written. And so many textbooks are not, you know, one thing that we know now is that it takes much longer to process passive construction than it does active construction.
Mm-hmm.
So if books are written, and many science books are, if books are written in passive voice, it becomes even more difficult for our students to understand them, or to construct the knowledge, because a lot of it might have gotten lost. Did I see another hand? Or yes?
I had a different experience. I wasn't frustrated. I saw it as kind of a puzzle that I was tasked to figure out, and it was more like a game. Like, how can I apply meaning to this somehow?
So this is interesting what you're saying, because I do this exercise with my education students. I teach a course called Introduction to the Field of Education, and I always go like, how did it feel? And half my students are like, oh, it was really stimulating. I felt challenged. I felt like I was solving a puzzle. And half of my students are like, I hated this. I felt like just throwing it on the floor and leaving the room. And then I wonder, you know, how does that map onto the different mindsets also? One thing I do want to say is research now, well, some of the research is showing that our brains are not really designed, really, to do what school asks us to do. You know, we always think that, oh, we're good analyzers and synthesizers and evaluators, but really, you know, our brain is much easier to deal with information that goes through the amygdala, that, you know, reptile part of your brain that we've had since primitive years, and that part of your brain wants you to make snap decisions. So I'm walking, you know, in the jungle or wherever I am, and I see something that could be a stick or a snake. I don't really have time to analyze it. I have to make the decision now. So the cortex is much newer. It's a baby in terms of evolution, and the cortex is where we do our analyzing and synthesizing and evaluating. And so, you know, it doesn't always feel comfortable. It feels like it's hard work to do that. But research shows that if you do something that you consider challenging and you accomplish it, you get a rush of endorphins. So when people actually, you don't do it from accomplishing tasks that are too easy. But if you accomplish a task that's a little challenging, it kind of gives you a high. And so if we can help our students get to that point where they're succeeding, and I want to show you one last thing before I turn our attention to what could we do with our students, how could we translate this into writer-coach connection coaching. But I want to show you one last thing. And this has to do, does this turn to a clean side? No. Will it stay?
It will stay.
Right. One thing that, thank you. I'm taking you with me all day today. One thing I wanted to do before I ended all of this was also talk to you about the writing process. So there are two models of how people write, the writing process. One of them is the knowledge telling model. Okay, so when students subscribe to this model, and frequently our students do, and frequently, unfortunately, they do as a result sometimes of the teacher's instruction, which I'll explain in a minute. So what they do is they look at the prompt, and based on the prompt, they start a memory search in their heads for relevant content. And then they type in their relevant content, and then they look at the content to generate more content. And then they look at that to generate more content. So that their writing process is very forward-looking. As a writer, they're concerned only with what I'm going to say next. Okay? So there's another model of writing which is called the knowledge transforming model. And this is really the most appropriate model for academic essay writing. So that model contains the knowledge telling model. It has it inserted inside of it, but it also has two other things. It has two problem spaces. So there's one problem space that deals with content. What am I going to write? And then it has the rhetorical problem space, which deals with how am I going to write it. So frequently, if you're doing the real writing process, what ends up happening here is that you spend a lot of time on writing as a problem-solving activity, which it really is. It is a problem-solving activity. So first you have to figure out, what am I going to write? What do I want to say? What am I talking about? What am I saying? And as soon as you figure that out, then you have to figure out, how am I going to say it? There's something about the process of figuring out how you want to say something that actually makes the thing you want to say transform into a better understanding of what you originally understood it to be. So now you're like, wait a minute, I have a better idea of what I want to say. Once you have a better idea of what you want to say, you're back trying to figure out how to say it. So these problem spaces act like a dialectical, okay, feeding into each other. Every time you solve a problem in one space, you need to solve the problem. It creates a problem for the other space, and it goes back and forth like that. How many of you have had that experience when you're writing something? You know, the more you write, the more you realize that's not what I want to say. You get a deeper understanding of what you're writing, and that's why the writing process is a process of discovery. So sometimes, you know, having your students come up with a thesis statement first may not be the most effective way of getting them to discover their ideas. Sometimes they just, maybe you can frame it as having a working thesis so that they have something to organize their paper around. But as they work through their paper, they should be discovering new ideas and deepening their understanding of their old ideas. And one thing that, I don't know how, one thing that I'm a little bit concerned about, but this, you know, I don't really know as coaches what we can do about that. And that is sometimes when teachers just prescribe the 5-paragraph essay, and that essay is very prescriptive, you know, like they have a formula for it. So, you know, real writing in the real world doesn't work that way, and it doesn't work that way. They're not allowing the students to do this, to engage in the problem-solving activity that real writing really is. And the students are spending a lot of time, a lot of cognitive energy trying to fill in those blank spaces instead of grappling with what to say and how to say it. So, you know, one of the most important things that I like to teach my students is that writing, in addition to a problem-solving activity, is also a meaning-making activity. That your job is not to plug into a formula or to memorize all these rules, but to write in a way that makes what you want to say as clear as possible to some outside reader. So, with all this in mind, so I'm looking at the time, I'd like to just start a discussion on, so knowing information processing, knowing construction of knowledge, knowing the importance of schema, knowing about writing process. How could we take all of these like seemingly high theoretical ideas and actually use them as writing coaches? What could we do with the knowledge we've just constructed? Take a moment, and actually, what I'd like you to do, because this is the best way, and that's why writing coaching is lovely, cognition actually increases with social interaction. So I would actually like you to turn to a partner and just say what you think. Just talk about ways that you can use this information. Maybe you feel you can't use this information. You can talk about that too. But just talk about how does any of this really apply or could apply to working with your students. So maybe we can just, maybe you guys could be a pair.